The air in the Temple of Dender, at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was thick with the oppressive scent of hothouse lilies and vintage perfume. A fragrant smokescreen for the metallic tang of ambition that clung to the 1,000-plus guests. It was the annual philanthropic Vanguard Gala, the apex of New York's social calendar, where old money and new tech collided in a dazzling, brutal spectacle of performative charity. Ilara Vance stood near the reflecting pool, a ghost in a graphite silk gown, her presence a carefully calibrated intrusion. To them, she was the enigmatic founder of Ethelred Analytics, a fintech startup whose disruptive algorithms were making titans of industry very, very nervous. It was a persona she had forged in fire and silence, polished to a brilliant, impenetrable sheen over 10 painstaking years. Her gaze, cool and appraising, swept across the room, a landscape of couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos, of diamonds that glittered like captive stars, and smiles that were as sharp and dangerous as the shards of a broken mirror. She was a predator in a room full of them, but her camouflage was perfect. No one saw the girl from St. Jude's orphanage, the one who had survived on scraps and fury. They saw only Ilara Vance, a name she had chosen for its clean, aristocratic lines, a name that tasted like power. Then she saw him, Julian Croft. He was holding court near the entrance, a sun king in his own manufactured universe. His laughter, a rich, melodious baritone, carried across the muted clinking of crystal tumblers. He was a corporate raider, a titan of leveraged buyouts, a man who collected companies the way other men collected art, tearing them down to their bones and selling the pieces for a profit. To the world, he was a visionary. To Ilara, he was the architect of her oldest pain. Their eyes met across the cavernous room. His smile didn't falter, but a subtle, chilling shift occurred in his gaze. It was the detached, assessing look of an auctioneer pricing an antique, an object with a past he knew intimately and was prepared to exploit. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement that was both a greeting and a threat. Ilara returned it with a composure so absolute, it was a declaration of war. Later, Julian took the stage. The gala was in his honor. He had made a 9-figure donation to the museum's acquisition fund, a strategic act of public benevolence designed to launder a reputation built on corporate destruction. A hush fell over the room as he approached the lectern. The lights dimmed, isolating him in a warm, reverent spotlight. "Thank you, all of you, for being here," he began, his voice resonating with practiced humility. "We gather tonight to celebrate art, to celebrate history, but I believe the most profound art, the most compelling history, is the story of human resilience." Ilara's hands, hidden in the folds of her gown, clenched into fists. She knew this script. She knew every beat, every pause, every carefully crafted emotional crescendo. "I'm often asked," Julian continued, leaning into the microphone, his tone becoming confidential, intimate, "what drives me? And I always come back to the same thing, the unshakable belief that you are not defined by where you come from, but by what you have the strength to take for yourself." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a perfect soundbite for the fawning journalist in the back. "I think of the stories we never hear," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before landing. With surgical precision, on Ilara, the stories from the forgotten places, the quiet, desperate corners of this country. I'm reminded of a story I heard once, about a little girl in a rundown orphanage upstate, a place of cold floors and thinner blankets. This girl, she was a survivor. Oh, yes, a true fighter. The room was rapt. The anecdote was charming, a classic tale of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps. But for Alara, every word was a razor blade. He was talking about St. Jude's. Her St. Jude's. There was a fire at this orphanage, Julian said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A tragedy. A night of terror and confusion. And in the chaos, this little girl, she saw her chance. While others were lost, while others faltered, she got out. She saved herself. She ran and never looked back. The subtext was a poisoned dart aimed directly at Alara's heart. He was twisting her survival into an act of supreme selfishness. He was painting her as a coward. The whispers began to ripple through the audience, discreet and venomous. Heads turned, eyes, sharp with curiosity and malice, darted towards her. They all knew. The rumors of her obscure origins had been the subject of much speculation, and Julian had just confirmed them in the most public and humiliating way possible. He hadn't just exposed her past. He had defined it for them, framing her entire life's work as the product of a foundational act of betrayal. The humiliation was a cold, physical thing, pressing in on her, stealing the air from her lungs. But Alara Vance did not flinch. She did not look away. She held Julian's gaze, her expression a mask of placid indifference. Her stillness was her shield and her sword. But beneath the mask, the girl she had been, Eleanor, was screaming. The scent of lilies was suddenly the acrid smell of smoke. The muted chatter was the sound of panicked cries. The glittering diamonds were the embers dancing in the black, suffocating air. A flashback, sharp and searing. The heat was a living thing, a monster devouring the old wooden dormitory. Smoke clawed at her throat. She was small, 10 years old, pulling a smaller hand behind her. Lily, Julian's sister. Lily's coughs were weak, ragged. "I can't. Ellie," she rasped, her small body stumbling. "I can't breathe." The floorboards groaned, then splintered under the fire's assault. A falling beam crashed down between them, a fiery wall of separation. Lily's hand was gone. Her scream was swallowed by the roar of the inferno. Alara had stood frozen for a second that stretched into an eternity, before the primal instinct for survival took over and she scrambled towards a broken window, the sound of Lily's cries branding themselves onto her soul. Julian was finishing his speech now, accepting a thunderous ovation. He raised his glass, his eyes still locked on hers. To the survivors. He toasted, his smile a rictus of triumph, whatever the cost. Alara raised her own champagne flute in a silent, chilling salute. The mask was back in place, flawless and absolute. He had won this battle, using her deepest trauma as a weapon in a crowded room, but in the cold, quiet vault of her heart, where Eleanor still lived, a promise was renewed. He thought this was of her story. He had no idea it was the beginning of his. Alara's penthouse on the 72nd floor of a sterile glass tower in Hudson Yards was not a home. It was a command center, while the world she moved through was one of suffocating grandeur. Her private space was an exercise in brutalist minimalism, polished concrete floors, raw steel accents, and vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a god's-eye view of the city, a city she intended to conquer. There were no photographs, no sentimental trinkets, no personal touches to soften the hard edges. The only art on the walls was a complex, sprawling network of charts, timelines, and financial projections, all interconnected with colored lines of string. At its center, like a spider in a vast and intricate web, was a photograph of Julian Croft. Surrounding him were dozens of other faces, his board members, his key executives, his mistresses, his political allies, his estranged family members. Each was a node in the network of power he had built, and each, Alara knew, had a vulnerability. For 10 years, She had lived a double life. By day, she was Alara Vance, the brilliant, reclusive CEO of Ethelred Analytics, a company she had built from the ground up. Her algorithms, which could predict market fluctuations with uncanny accuracy, were her legitimate claim to power, the engine that funded her real work. By night, she was the silent, obsessive strategist, the ghost haunting Julian Croft's empire. The name, Ethelred, was a private joke. Ethelred the Unready, the English king undone by bad advice and betrayal. It was a constant reminder to trust no one. Her new identity had been her chrysalis. After escaping the smoldering ruins of St. Jude's, Eleanor, a ward of the state with no connections and no future, had simply ceased to exist. She had aged out of the foster care system, worked 3 jobs to put herself through college and then graduate school, excelling in computer science and quantitative finance. She had shed her past like a snake shedding its skin, changing her name, altering her appearance, and erasing every trace of the frightened girl who had run from a fire. Alara Vance was born from the ashes, a woman with no history, only a future she was building with relentless, single-minded focus. The trauma of the fire was a cold, hard stone in her chest. She did not allow herself the luxury of grief or guilt. Those emotions were weaknesses, and weakness was a death sentence. Julian, who had been one of the older, bullying boys at the orphanage, had found a way to channel his grief into a twisted, vengeful rage. He had inherited a small sum from a distant relative shortly after the fire, and used it with a sociopathic genius for leverage, building his fortune with a ruthlessness that mirrored the fire that had consumed his sister. And, for 25 years, he had nurtured a singular, poisonous obsession, destroying the girl he blamed for her death. He had hunted her. His first attempts, years ago, had been crude. When she won a prestigious scholarship, an anonymous tip to the board about her unstable background almost had it revoked. When she got her first job at a Wall Street firm, a whisper campaign about her being untrustworthy saw her fired within 6 months. He was the ghost in her machine. The invisible force that ensured every step forward was met with a brutal pushback. That was when she realized she couldn't outrun him. She had to turn and fight. She had to build a fortress so high and a weapon so powerful that he couldn't touch her. She had to become Alara Vance. Her revenge was not a simple, emotional impulse. It was a grand strategy, a meticulously planned corporate takeover. Julian's cruelty was not limited to her. His flagship company, Croft Enterprises, was a monument to his character. It acquired sound, stable businesses, loaded them with debt, stripped them of their assets, and discarded the hollowed-out shells, leaving thousands of employees jobless and communities devastated. Her mission, therefore, had a dual purpose: personal vengeance and a form of righteous, systemic justice. She would not just destroy the man. She would dismantle his toxic legacy and use its components to build something better. She stood before the wall, tracing the lines of connection with her finger. The Met Gala humiliation was not a random act of cruelty. It was a strategic strike. She knew why he'd done it, and why now. It was all about the impending deal with Reinhard Stiegler, a deeply conservative, old-money European investment firm. Securing their backing would give Ethelred the capital injection she needed to launch the final phase of her plan, the proxy battle for control of Croft Enterprises. Julian must have learned of the negotiations. His speech was a poison pill, designed to spook the cautious Europeans by painting Alara as a fraud, a woman with a fabricated past and a dubious character. Her phone chimed, the sound sharp and intrusive in the silent apartment. It was an encrypted message from her lawyer, Marcus Thorne. The subject line contained a single word: Reinhardt. Alara's jaw tightened. She already knew what it would say. The message was as polite and devastating as she had expected. Herr Schmidt of Reinhard Stiegler extended his deepest regrets. But after further due diligence, they felt that a partnership would be unwise at this juncture. He cited vague concerns about reputational risks and a lack of transparency regarding Ms. Vance's personal history. Julian's words from the gala, laundered through the sterile language of corporate finance. The deal was dead. A year of careful negotiation, of building trust, of demonstrating Ethelred's unassailable performance, all undone by a single, malicious anecdote. The final straw had not just been laid. It had been driven through her heart. For years, her plan had been a slow, patient siege. Now, it was time to storm the castle. The time for subtlety was over. "Anya," Ilara said, activating the secure comms link to her chief analyst. Phase 1. The Apex logistics leak. Execute. "Are you sure?" Anya Sharma's voice was steady, but with an undercurrent of concern. "The Reinhardt deal just collapsed. Our capital position is exposed. If he retaliates..." "He just did. Anya, this is the retaliation." Anya was more than just a forensic accountant. She was a virtuoso of financial warfare and a fellow survivor of Julian's brand of destruction. Her father's manufacturing business had been one of Croft Enterprises' early acquisitions. Anya had watched, helpless, as Julian had dismantled her family's legacy, leading to her father's financial ruin and early death. Ilara had found her working at a top-tier accounting firm, her talent buried under mountains of corporate drudgery, her soul simmering with a quiet, unchanneled rage. Anya didn't need to be convinced of the mission's morality. She only ever questioned its timing. The plan was simple. Apex Logistics, a subsidiary of Croft Enterprises, had been systematically overbilling the Department of Defense for years. Anya had unearthed the fraud months ago. A beautiful, undeniable pattern of falsified invoices and ghost shipments buried in layers of shell corporations. Leaking a portion of that evidence to a trusted financial journalist should, in theory, trigger an SEC inquiry, send the stock down a few percentage points, and, most importantly, force Julian to divert resources and attention to damage control, leaving other flanks exposed. Within the hour, the story broke. It was a clean hit. The journalist protected his source. The evidence was ironclad, and the market reacted as expected. Croft Enterprises stock dipped by 4% in after-hours trading. A minor wound, but a satisfying one. Ilara allowed herself a brief, cold flicker of triumph. The triumph lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, Julian Croft appeared on every major financial news network. He wasn't defensive. He was proactive. He looked directly into the camera, his expression a mask of grave sincerity, and announced that he had personally uncovered deep-rooted corruption within an underperforming subsidiary. He had, he claimed, brought this information to the SEC himself as part of a new corporate integrity initiative. He was dissolving Apex Logistics, taking the financial loss, and turning the responsible executives over to the authorities. It was a masterstroke of public relations. He had taken her attack and spun it into a narrative of his own strength and ethical leadership. By midday, the stock had not only recovered, it had surged by 7%. Julian was being hailed as a new model of corporate responsibility. Ilara watched him on screen, her blood turning to ice. He hadn't just deflected the blow, he had anticipated it. The speed and precision of his response were impossible. He knew the attack was coming. He knew exactly which subsidiary and what information she had. There was only one conceivable explanation. She had a traitor in her inner circle. The very thought was a violation. A cold blade sliding between her ribs. Her circle was impossibly small, built on years of trust and shared purpose. There was Marcus, her lawyer, whose family had known her since before she became Alara. There was Anya, whose personal vendetta against Julian was as deep as her own. And there was Arthur Kensington. Arthur. The thought was a physical blow. Arthur was her mentor, a revered elder statesman of finance, who had taken her under his wing when she was just starting out. He had opened doors, made introductions, and offered counsel that had proven invaluable. He was the closest thing she had to a father figure. His advice had always been cautious, measured. Don't move too quickly, my dear. A man like Croft has eyes everywhere. Patience is your greatest weapon. Advice she had always taken as wisdom, but which now sounded like a tactic for delay. A cold dread washed over her. The foundation of her carefully constructed world had just cracked. She had built a fortress against her enemy, never imagining the enemy was already inside the gates. The realization of betrayal settled not with fire, but with ice. It clarified everything. Alara's world, which had seemed complex and fraught with unseen dangers, suddenly snapped into sharp, brutal focus. She was surrounded. Her carefully laid plans were not just plans. They were compromised intelligence, handed directly to the enemy. She was not the hunter. She was the prey, being allowed to think she was in control. She convened her core team in the penthouse, her war room. Marcus Thorne arrived first. He was a man whose presence was inherently calming, a rock in a churning sea. His loyalty was an old, comfortable fact, forged in a childhood where he had known her as Eleanor. The quiet, fiercely intelligent foster kid his parents had always championed. He alone knew the full truth of her transformation, and he carried that knowledge with a lawyer's discretion and a friend's devotion. It was Arthur, Alara said. Without preamble, there was no need for accusations or evidence. The simple statement hung in the sterile air, an undeniable truth. Marcus sank into one of the severe leather chairs, his face etched with a sorrow that mirrored her own. Are you certain? Julian's response to the Apex leak was a prepared script. He knew the play before we ran it. Alara explained, her voice devoid of emotion. Think back, Marcus. Every piece of advice Arthur has given me for the past year has been a variation on wait. He advised me against the aggressive acquisition of Ethelred seed funding. He cautioned me against approaching Reinhard Stiegler directly. He told me the Apex leak was too risky. Every move he counseled against was a move that would have accelerated the timeline. Anya arrived minutes later, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, her expression already grim. She had reached the same conclusion on her own. I ran a trace, she said, her voice tight. A few months ago, Arthur's personal hedge fund was on the brink of collapse after a bad bet on currency futures. It was a catastrophic, career-ending loss. 2 days later, the fund was mysteriously recapitalized by an anonymous infusion of cash from a holding company in the Cayman Islands. She projected a complex financial diagram onto the wall, a web of transactions, of shell corporations and blind trusts. I unspooled it. It took me all night. The money trail leads back to a private equity firm. The firm is owned by a larger conglomerate, and the conglomerate is a wholly owned, unaudited subsidiary of Croft Enterprises. There it was. Julian didn't use threats. He used hooks. He found a person's moment of desperation, and he bought their soul. Arthur Kensington, the paragon of Wall Street integrity, was just another asset in Julian's portfolio. The betrayal cut deeper than any of Julian's public attacks. It was personal. It was intimate. Arthur had groomed her for success, all while reporting her progress back to her mortal enemy. The knowledge reframed every success, tainted every memory. She felt a brief, searing flare of rage, followed by the cold, clear calm of necessity. There was no time for mourning. "The old plan is dead," Alara announced. "He knows we're coming for him. He just doesn't know who we are. He thinks he's fighting a rival hedge fund, a corporate raider. He doesn't know it's Eleanor." She looked from Marcus to Anya. "From this moment on, we operate on a new protocol. No outside contact. No unsecured communications. We trust no one but the 3 people in this room. And we are no longer playing a long game. We're initiating a blitz." The new plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. A direct, hostile proxy battle for control of Croft Enterprises. Proxy battles were wars of attrition, fought over months or years, requiring immense capital and influence. They would have to do it in a matter of weeks, operating in total secrecy. "It's impossible," Marcus said, shaking his head. "We don't have the capital since Reinhardt pulled out, and we don't have the votes. Julian and his board control a solid 40% of the shares." "Then we find the capital," Alara countered, her eyes flashing with renewed intensity. "And we find the votes." The next few weeks were a blur of relentless, high-stakes work. It was a heist, executed on the battlefields of international finance. Anya became a digital ghost, diving deep into the financial underworld. She identified dozens of large, institutional shareholders in Croft Enterprises pension funds, university endowments, mutual funds who were growing uneasy with Julian's slash-and-burn tactics, but were too fragmented to mount a challenge. These were their targets. Alara, meanwhile, engaged in a campaign of social engineering that was both brilliant and draining. She used her Alara Vance persona to move through the rarefied circles Julian inhabited, at charity auctions, polo matches, and private dinners. She listened. She gathered intelligence, identifying disgruntled former executives Julian had cast aside, bitter rivals he had double-crossed, and ex-lovers he had discarded. Each held a piece of the puzzle, a story of his corruption, a detail of his financial vulnerabilities, a psychological weakness to be exploited. She collected these stories, these grievances, not as gossip, but as ammunition. Marcus became the legal architect of the assault. He worked tirelessly, drafting the complex legal frameworks for a network of shell corporations that would allow them to acquire shares without triggering SEC disclosure requirements. He found obscure loopholes in the Croft Enterprises corporate bylaws, clauses that could be used to challenge the board's authority and force a shareholder vote. They were a tightly knit guerrilla unit, waging an asymmetric war against a global empire. Alara mortgaged her penthouse, liquidated her personal portfolio, and leveraged every asset Ethelred Analytics owned to build their war chest. Every dollar went towards secretly acquiring shares, buying up small blocks of stock through their anonymous entities, a slow and steady accumulation that went unnoticed by Croft's watchdogs. The pressure was immense. They worked around the clock, fueled by caffeine and a shared sense of purpose. The threat of discovery hung over them constantly. Julian was not idle. He knew someone was maneuvering against him. His company's security division began aggressively investigating trading patterns. His lawyers began sending threatening letters to journalists who sniffed around the edges of his business dealings. He was a wounded shark, thrashing in the water, and it was only a matter of time before he caught their scent. The turning point came from an unlikely source, an ex-girlfriend of Julian's, a woman he had flaunted and then cruelly discarded. Gave Alara a piece of information in an act of petty revenge. It was a ledger number for an account in a private Swiss bank. He called it his rainy day fund, the woman had said, sipping a martini at a quiet bar in the West Village. I think he enjoyed telling me things I wasn't supposed to know. It made him feel powerful. Anya worked on the ledger number for 72 straight hours. What she found was the key. It wasn't just a slush fund. It was the hub of Julian's entire criminal enterprise. A multi-billion-dollar account used for bribery, money laundering, and market manipulation, all personally controlled by Julian. It was the ultimate vulnerability. If exposed, it wouldn't just cost him his company. It would cost him his freedom. "We have him," Anya whispered, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes alight with victory. "We can't access the account, but the existence of it. If we leak this, the federal authorities will tear him apart." "No," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "A leak gives him a chance to spin the story, to cut a deal, to survive. He doesn't get to survive. We're not going to leak it. We're going to use it as leverage to get the final votes we need. And then I'm going to take it all from him, in person, where he can't hide." She looked at the date on the calendar. The Croft Enterprises annual shareholder meeting was in 3 weeks. The stage was set. The decision not to confront Arthur Kensington was a strategic one. An open accusation would have confirmed his suspicions and alerted Julian. Instead, Alara treated him with a cold, surgical precision. She cut him out. Communication ceased. Meetings were canceled. When he called, his calls went unanswered. She made him a ghost, left to wonder and to fear. A punishment she knew would be more agonizing for a man like him than any direct confrontation. But his betrayal had taught her a valuable lesson. She was alone. The realization was not frightening. It was liberating. It stripped away the last of her sentimentality, leaving only the hard, unyielding core of her purpose. This new isolation was tested almost immediately. Alara had scheduled a clandestine meeting with the manager of a large state pension fund, a man named Robert Chen. Chen controlled a 3% block of Croft Enterprises stock, and his quiet dissatisfaction with Julian's management was well known in their circles. Winning his vote was crucial. The meeting was set at a neutral location, a private room in an unassuming downtown club. Alara arrived to find the room empty. After 10 minutes, she received a text message from Chen. "Something's come up. Can't make it. My apologies." It was curt, dismissive. 2 hours later, a press release announced that the state pension fund had signed a new, highly favorable long-term agreement with Croft Enterprises, publicly endorsing Julian's leadership. Julian had gotten to him. The message was clear. "I know you're courting my shareholders, and I will crush you." The trap had been laid with Arthur's help. He must have known about her overtures to Chen and fed the information to Julian. They had used her own strategy against her, luring her out into the open. Now, Julian was fully aware that a coordinated effort was underway to build a coalition against him. His paranoia, always simmering just beneath his charismatic surface, would now be at a full boil. The hunt had begun in earnest. Anya's frantic call came the next morning. "Alara, we have a problem. A big one." The financial attack was brutal and swift. Julian, using his immense influence with the big investment banks, initiated a coordinated short-sell attack on Ethelred Analytics. Rumors began to fly on the trading floors. Ethelred's vaunted algorithm was a fraud. Their earnings were inflated. A key government contract was about to be revoked. The stories were baseless. But in the volatile world of tech stocks, perception was reality. Ethelred's stock price, which had been the source of Alara's power and funding, began to hemorrhage value. It dropped 10% in the first hour of trading, then 20%. By noon, it was in a full-blown freefall. Margin calls started coming in. Their credit lines were frozen. The financial empire Alara had spent a decade building was being dismantled before her eyes in a matter of hours. They were facing a liquidity crisis. Bankruptcy was no longer a remote possibility. It was a matter of days away. Simultaneously, the second front of the attack opened. Marcus called, his voice grim. "There's a reporter from the Ledger asking questions. A man named Sullivan. He's a notorious hatchet man. Julian must have hired him." "What is he asking?" Alara asked, her voice calm, belying the storm raging inside her. "He's digging into you. Ilara. Not your company. You. He's asking about your past. He mentioned he's heading upstate to look into records for a defunct institution. The St. Jude's Orphanage." The blood drained from Alara's face. This was Julian's killing blow. He wasn't just trying to bankrupt her. He was trying to unmake her. He was going to exhume Eleanor and parade her corpse in public, exposing the trauma and the reinvention, destroying the credibility and mystery that made Alara Vance who she was. The clock was ticking. Sullivan would dig, and he would find the fire, the death of Lily Croft, and the official reports. He would find the story Julian wanted him to find. This was her lowest point. The walls were closing in. Her company was collapsing. Her identity was about to be shattered. And the man responsible was celebrating his victory. The rage she had kept locked away for so long, the cold, controlled anger that had fueled her for a decade, threatened to break free for a fleeting moment. She felt the pull of despair, the urge to let it all burn. Then she looked at her wall, at the web of connections, at the face of Julian Croft smiling out from the central photograph. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fear was a traitor she would not harbor. She had come too far, sacrificed too much. "Anya," she said into the comms, her voice hardening into steel. "Liquidate the emergency fund, every last dollar. Funnel it through the shells and buy every share of Croft Enterprises you can get your hands on. Use the stock collapse as cover. No one will be looking for a buyer in this panic." "Alara, that's our last reserve," Anya protested. "If this doesn't work, we have nothing. We'll be wiped out." "I know," Alara said. "Marcus, get me everything you can on Sullivan. His vices, his debts, his enemies. We're not going to stonewall him. We're going to give him a different story. A better one." She was cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Julian thought he was finishing the fight. He was about to find out he had just made his final, fatal mistake. The grand ballroom of the Croft Tower in Hudson Yards was a cathedral of corporate power. 3 stories high, encased in glass, it offered a panoramic view of the storm-lashed Manhattan skyline. Outside, a ferocious thunderstorm raged, rain hammering against the windows in violent sheets, lightning fracturing the bruised purple sky. Inside, the atmosphere was just as charged. It was the annual shareholder meeting for Croft Enterprises, and the room was packed with the most powerful men and women in American finance. Julian Croft stood at the podium, a master of his universe. He was radiant, exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had, in his mind, already won. Ethelred Analytics was a smoking crater, its stock trading at pennies on the dollar. The mysterious rival who had been buying up his shares had gone silent. The reporter, Sullivan, was about to publish a career-destroying exposé on the upstart Alara Vance. Julian felt untouchable. "And so, in closing," he said, his voice smooth and commanding, resonating through the cavernous space. Despite baseless attacks from shadowy competitors, Croft Enterprises has delivered another year of record-breaking growth. Our future has never been brighter. A polite, solid round of applause filled the room. The board members on stage behind him beamed. The agenda moved to the final item, the perfunctory re-election of the board of directors. A formality. "Are there any other motions from the floor?" the chairman asked, already preparing to adjourn. A voice, calm and clear, cut through the expectant silence. "I have a motion." Every head turned. From the center aisle, Alara Vance emerged, walking towards the stage. She was not dressed for a corporate meeting, but for a funeral. A simple, severe black dress. Her hair pulled back, her face pale and composed. She moved with an unnerving, deliberate grace, a specter of judgment in a room of complacent power. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. Julian's smile froze on his face, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. "Ms. Vance," the chairman stammered, caught off guard. "This is a private meeting for shareholders." "I am a shareholder," Alara said, her voice amplified by a hidden microphone. "Or rather, the consortium of investment entities I represent is a shareholder. As of 9 a.m. this morning, we control 32% of this company's voting stock." A collective gasp went through the room. 32% was an impossible number. Combined with the disgruntled institutional investors Alara had been courting, it was a controlling interest. Julian's face went white. He stared at her, the confident mask cracking to reveal the enraged bully beneath. "Security!" he snarled. "Remove this woman!" "It's too late for that, Julian," Alara said, stepping onto the stage. She moved not towards him, but towards the main lectern, as if she owned it. Two large security guards started towards her, but paused, uncertain, as several powerful fund managers in the front row stood up, shaking their heads. They were with her. The tide had already turned. "I have a motion to replace the current board of directors," Alara announced, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the shareholders. "On the grounds of gross mismanagement, dereliction of fiduciary duty, and systemic corporate fraud." On the massive screen behind the stage, which had been displaying Croft Enterprises' soaring revenue charts, a new image appeared. The logo for Ethelred Analytics, Anya, working from a remote, secure location, was now in control. "For the past year," Alara began, her voice steady and damning, "Julian Croft has used company resources to engage in a campaign of market manipulation and corporate sabotage against a competitor. A campaign that culminated in a baseless short-sell attack that has exposed this company to billions of dollars in future liability." The screen flickered, displaying internal Croft Enterprises emails, trading records, evidence of the conspiracy. The room was in an uproar. "He did this," Alara continued, her voice rising, "to cover up the real story, the story of a company that is not a beacon of growth, but a hollow shell, its profits artificially inflated by years of fraudulent accounting." Anya's fingers flew across her keyboard. The screen now showed a complex flowchart. It was the Swiss bank account, the rainy day fund, details of offshore transfers, falsified invoices, and payments to corrupt officials flashed across the screen, irrefutable proof of a criminal empire. The live stock ticker in the corner of every news broadcast in the room began to nosedive. The word "panic" flashed in red. Julian lunged for the microphone. "Lies. These are fabricated documents from a desperate, bankrupt competitor," he roared. He turned his full, venomous attention on Alara. "You think you can come into my house and do this? You think I don't know who you really are? Eleanor." He spat her old name like a curse. The room fell silent. He had made his final, catastrophic error. He had opened the door to the past. Alara turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Julian. I am Eleanor." She turned back to the audience. "He's right. My name was Eleanor. We grew up together, in a place called St. Jude's Orphanage. His obsession with me. This corporate war, it has nothing to do with business. It's about a fire at that orphanage, 25 years ago. A fire that killed his younger sister, Lily." The air in the room crackled. The story had shifted from a financial thriller to a Greek tragedy. She left her. Julian screamed, his composure completely gone, his face contorted with a quarter-century of grief and rage. She was a coward. She ran and left my sister to die in the fire. She saved herself. Alara let his words hang in the silent room. She waited for his tirade to subside into ragged, panting breaths. Then, she gave a slight nod. On the screen, a new document appeared. It was a scanned, official report from the county fire marshal, dated the day after the fire. The title was visible to everyone: Cause and Origin Investigation Report, St. Jude's Orphanage. For 25 years. I believed I was a coward, Alara said, her voice now quiet, filled with a profound, aching sorrow. I believed I ran, but I never knew why the fire started. Julian, with his newfound inheritance, used his influence to have the official report buried. He never wanted the truth to come out. She pointed to the screen. But old records are hard to erase completely. The fire marshal, a man named Captain Miller, is now retired, and his memory is excellent. He was more than willing to provide a sworn affidavit confirming the authenticity of his original findings. Anya highlighted a section of the report. The text was clear. The fire originated in a ground-floor storage closet. Point of origin indicates ignition of flammable cleaning materials by a discarded smoking object, likely a cigarette. A storage closet, Ilara said, her eyes boring into Julian's. That the older boys used as their secret smoking den, a place Lily was never allowed to go. Julian was shaking his head, backing away, a horrified denial dawning on his face. No. It was the wiring. They said it was old wiring. Ilara gave one last, final nod to Anya. The screen changed for the last time. It was not a document. It was a faded photograph. A picture of a teenage Julian, his arm slung proudly around his little sister, Lily. He was smiling at the camera, and, in his other hand, held casually at his side, was a silver Zippo lighter, its distinctive shape unmistakable. Captain Miller's report mentions an object recovered from the point of origin, Ilara said, her voice barely a whisper. A Zippo lighter. He remembers it vividly because it was engraved with the initials JC. The truth landed with the force of a physical explosion. The collective, horrified gasp of the audience was drowned out by the thunderclap that shook the entire skyscraper. Julian's rage, his vengeance, his entire life's crusade. It was all a monstrous projection of his own unbearable guilt. He hadn't been avenging his sister. He had been running from the fact that he had killed her. Julian Croft stared at the photograph of himself as a boy with a lighter, a boy who had made a stupid, tragic mistake. And he let out a sound that was not human. It was a howl of pure, absolute agony, of a soul shattering into a million pieces. He collapsed onto the stage, a titan reduced to a broken, weeping child. The market closing bell rang, its electronic tone a final, merciless punctuation mark. Outside, the storm broke. Inside, amidst the chaos of shouting reporters, stunned board members, and approaching authorities, Ilara Vance stood perfectly still. She had won. The cost of that victory, the sheer tragic weight of it, was only just beginning to settle. The hours that followed were a chaotic montage of flashing news reports, urgent phone calls, and the quiet hum of victory in the war room. Julian Croft arrested. Croft Enterprises, assets frozen. SEC launches full-scale investigation. The headlines scrolled across every screen. Monuments to a fallen empire, his powerful allies. The men and women who had laughed at his jokes at the Met Gala were now lining up to publicly disavow him. their statements dripping with feigned shock and condemnation. The rats were fleeing a ship they had helped to sink. In the penthouse, the sprawling diagrams and timelines on the wall were now relics of a finished war. Anya, Marcus, and Alara sat in silence, the adrenaline of the climax slowly draining away, leaving a residue of profound exhaustion. There were no champagne corks popping, no cheers of celebration. The victory felt less like a triumph and more like the somber end of a long, painful siege. The weight of the final revelation. Julian's guilt had changed everything. It had transformed her quest for vengeance into the uncovering of a tragedy. She had set out to destroy a monster, only to reveal a broken man, haunted by a mistake he'd made as a boy. Alara stood by the window, watching the rain wash over the city. She had her victory. She had the power she had sought for a decade. She held the fate of what was left of Croft Enterprises in her hands. She was the new Titan. But the feeling was hollow, the silence in the room heavy with unspoken questions. Days later, she arranged a meeting. Arthur Kensington sat opposite her in the sterile visiting room of a low-security federal facility. He had been arrested as a co-conspirator, his plea deal contingent on his full cooperation. He looked 100 years old. The bespoke suit and confident air were gone, replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit and the vacant, defeated stare of a man who had lost everything. "Why?" Arthur Alara asked, her voice quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a question she needed to ask, not for retribution, but for understanding. "He had me," Arthur whispered, his eyes fixed on the tabletop between them. "A mistake I made. A long time ago. A bad trade. I should have been ruined, disbarred. Julian. He made it go away. He didn't ask for anything at the time. He just owned me. He knew one day he would call in the debt." He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a pathetic, pleading sorrow. "When he told me who you were, what he wanted, I tried to slow you down. I thought if I could just delay you, he would be satisfied. I never thought." His voice trailed off. Alara simply nodded. There was nothing more to say. She felt no anger, only a profound, weary pity. He was another piece of collateral damage in Julian's self-destructive war. She didn't offer forgiveness, but she left him with a semblance of peace, a quiet closure to a painful chapter. The biggest question remained. Marcus laid it out for her in her office a week later. "You have a controlling interest. Alara, the company is in ruins, but the underlying assets are still valuable. You can liquidate, break it up, and sell it for parts. Just like Julian would have done. You could walk away with a 10-figure fortune and never work another day in your life." It was the final act of destruction, the logical endpoint of her revenge. To salt the earth of his empire so that nothing could ever grow there again. It was what she had planned for, what she had told herself she wanted for 10 years. She thought of the fire, of the ruins of St. Jude's, of Lily, of the countless people whose lives had been destroyed by the company she now controlled. Liquidation was an ending. It was destruction. But after the raw, painful truth of the shareholder meeting, destruction no longer felt like justice. Justice, she was beginning to realize, had to be about more than just tearing things down. It had to be about building something in their place. "No," she said to Marcus, a new clarity hardening in her voice. "We're not going to liquidate it. We're going to rebuild it." 6 months later, the air in upstate New York was crisp and clean, smelling of pine and damp earth. A bright, optimistic sun shone down on a plot of land that had, for 25 years, been nothing but a field of weeds and forgotten foundations. It was the former site of the St. Jude's orphanage. Today, however, It was a bustling construction site, the skeletal framework of a new building reaching for the sky. Alara stood at a podium, dressed not in the severe armor of the city, but in a simple linen dress. The crowd before her was not made up of investors and socialites, but of local community members, educators, and a throng of excited children from nearby schools. "Power can be used to break things," she said, her voice carrying over the gentle breeze. "To shatter lives, to dismantle companies, to tear down reputations. I have learned that it is much harder, and much more meaningful, to use power to build." She gestured to the structure behind her. This place was once a site of tragedy. Today, we break ground on a new beginning. We are building a place of opportunity, of education, and of hope. A sign at the edge of the site announced its name in clean, elegant letters: the Lilycroft Center for Youth and Education. It was the ultimate refutation of Julian's legacy. She had taken the toxic assets of his corrupt empire and transmuted them, funding the foundation with the profits from the restructured, newly ethical Croft Enterprises. She had not destroyed his name. She had redeemed it, tying it forever to an act of creation, not destruction. This was her true victory. Not the ruin of one man, but the chance at a better future for thousands of children who, like her, had started with nothing. Her empowerment was no longer about vengeance. It was about purpose. After the groundbreaking ceremony, as Alara was speaking with the new center's director, an aide approached her quietly and handed her a single, plain envelope. The return address was a state correctional facility. Her heart gave a slight, involuntary lurch. It was from Julian. She walked away from the crowd, finding a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree at the edge of the property. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter. She didn't know what to expect: more rage, pleas, accusations. Inside, there was a single sheet of cheap, lined paper. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike, a stark contrast to the bold, confident signature she had seen on 1,000 corporate documents. There were no excuses, no justifications, just 3 words, written in the center of the page: "I am sorry." Alara read the words over and over. They were an admission, a confession, a surrender. They did not erase the pain or the past. They did not absolve him of the lives he had ruined, including his own. But they were a beginning, a flicker of remorse in a lifetime of projected rage. It was a final, complex note of closure she hadn't known she needed. She carefully folded the letter and put it in her pocket. A weight she had carried for 25 years, the cold stone of guilt and grief, seemed to lighten, just a little. She looked at the foundation of the new building, a tangible symbol of a broken cycle. She had not only survived her past, she had transcended it, using its ashes to build a future, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the country air. She turned away from the ghosts of St. Jude's and walked towards the life that was waiting for her.